Most people believe Solomon and Joseph became wealthy because God simply handed them gold. That is the version repeated in churches, books, and motivational speeches. But when you look carefully at their lives, something uncomfortable appears. The gold came later. First came wisdom. First came structure. First came the ability to see what others ignored. That changes everything. Because if wealth was only a miracle, there would be nothing to learn, nothing to replicate, nothing to understand. But the biblical pattern reveals something far more dangerous. Wealth followed these men because they understood systems while everyone else chased survival. Solomon did not wake up rich. Before the ships, before the palaces, before the rivers of gold flowing into Jerusalem, he asked for one thing: discernment, clarity, the ability to govern wisely. And that wisdom allowed him to see opportunities invisible to ordinary men. Joseph followed the exact same pattern. He entered Egypt as a prisoner with no money, no land, no status, and no future. Yet even inside a prison, he was already developing the one asset that eventually made nations depend on him: strategic vision. While others reacted emotionally to circumstances, Joseph learned how to interpret patterns before crisis arrived. That is the secret nobody talks about. Neither man built wealth by chasing money directly. They built value, organization, infrastructure, preparation, and influence. Money became the byproduct, and this completely destroys the modern idea that prosperity belongs only to the lucky, the connected, or the gifted. Because the real source of biblical wealth was never possession. It was perception. The ability to recognize what could be built before anyone else understood its worth. Solomon understood something that modern people almost never question. Money by itself is weak. Gold sitting in a room produces nothing. Coins hidden in a vault eventually disappear. Wealth only becomes powerful when it moves through systems that continue producing value long after the original effort is finished. That is why Solomon never depended on static treasure. He built networks. Most people imagine Solomon surrounded by piles of gold inside a palace, but the biblical record paints a very different picture. His kingdom functioned like an enormous economic engine. He established maritime fleets, controlled trade corridors, negotiated alliances with surrounding nations, and positioned Israel between major commercial regions connecting Africa, Arabia, and Asia. He understood geography. He understood logistics. He understood flow. While ordinary men focused on earning, Solomon focused on circulation. This is why Scripture repeatedly mentions ships, merchants, traders, horses, cedar wood, spices, and international commerce whenever describing his kingdom. The wealth did not come from luck. It came from systems constantly generating movement and exchange. And this is the part most people miss. Solomon himself was not carrying merchandise through deserts or rowing ships across oceans. The system worked whether he was physically present or not. That is the difference between labor and leverage. A laborer must continue working to survive. A builder creates structures capable of multiplying effort beyond human limitation. This mentality was thousands of years ahead of its time. Even today, most people still live trapped inside linear income. They trade hours for survival and call it stability. But Solomon understood that true prosperity requires ownership over productive systems, not endless personal exertion. That is why his wealth expanded continuously while neighboring kingdoms struggled to maintain temporary prosperity. He thought beyond immediate consumption. Every alliance strengthened trade. Every trade route increased influence. Every infrastructure project expanded circulation. He was not obsessed with appearing rich. He was obsessed with constructing mechanisms that made wealth inevitable. And this reveals a principle hidden underneath the surface of his story. The richest people are rarely the ones working the hardest physically. They are often the ones who learned how to organize people, resources, timing, and opportunity more intelligently than everyone else. Solomon mastered that art. Gold was never the foundation of his kingdom. Wisdom was. The gold simply followed the intelligence of the structure he built around it. Joseph's story becomes even more shocking when you realize he built enormous economic power before he ever possessed personal wealth. That alone destroys the modern belief that money is the starting point of prosperity. Joseph began with nothing. No inheritance, no status, no land, no freedom. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, imprisoned, and forgotten. By every visible measurement, his life looked cursed. Yet, inside every environment he entered, the same pattern kept appearing. Order emerged around him. That is important, because wealth, in the biblical sense, was never simply the accumulation of money. It was the capacity to manage complexity without collapsing under pressure. And Joseph possessed that long before Pharaoh ever elevated him. Inside Potiphar's house, everything prospered under Joseph's management. Inside prison, the same thing happened again. Even before power officially arrived, stewardship was already visible. Joseph kept demonstrating an ability that few people develop. He could organize chaos. Then came the moment that changed Egypt forever. Pharaoh dreamed of 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of catastrophic famine. Most people focus only on Joseph interpreting the dream, but the true brilliance appeared afterward. Interpretation alone would not save a nation. Strategy would. Joseph immediately shifted from revelation into administration. He proposed a complete economic structure: store grain during abundance, establish reserve systems, distribute storage across cities, create centralized management, control circulation before scarcity arrived. This was not emotional leadership. This was long-term thinking operating under pressure. While everyone else would have celebrated temporary prosperity, Joseph understood something terrifying about human nature. People consume abundance as if it will last forever. They mistake a good season for a permanent condition. Joseph refused to think that way. During 7 years of abundance, he prepared for a crisis nobody else could yet feel. That is why famine eventually destroyed surrounding nations but elevated Egypt into unprecedented power. When scarcity arrived, Egypt possessed what the world lacked: reserves, structure, distribution, and control. And suddenly, nations that once ignored Egypt became dependent on it. Think about what really happened here. Joseph transformed preparation into influence. He understood that the person who solves the biggest problem eventually controls the flow of resources. That principle still governs the modern world, even if people no longer recognize it spiritually. Companies become powerful because they solve logistical problems. Banks become powerful because they control liquidity. Governments become powerful because they control distribution. Joseph mastered all three thousands of years ago, but there is an even deeper layer hidden inside his story. Joseph never treated saving as fear. Modern people often save reactively. They panic during uncertainty. They store resources because they are afraid. Joseph operated differently. His preparation came from vision, not anxiety. That distinction changes everything. Fear hoards, wisdom organizes. Fear freezes, wisdom prepares. Fear reacts to crisis. Wisdom sees crisis before it arrives. This is why Joseph became indispensable. Pharaoh did not merely see a dream interpreter standing before him. He saw a man capable of sustaining an entire civilization through intelligent administration. And that is the hidden connection between Joseph and Solomon. Both men understood that wealth is not created by chasing money emotionally. It is created by building systems strong enough to survive uncertainty. Money simply flows toward whoever can sustain order when everyone else falls into panic. The modern world teaches people to focus almost entirely on income. Get a better salary, work more hours, find a second job, chase higher commissions. But Solomon and Joseph operated from a completely different mental framework. They focused on control. Not control over people in the tyrannical sense, but control over production, distribution, timing, and resources. That is the invisible principle connecting both men. Solomon built systems that kept value moving across nations. Joseph built systems that protected value during collapse. One mastered expansion, the other mastered preservation. But both understood the same foundational truth. Whoever controls systems eventually controls outcomes. Most people never reach wealth because they remain trapped inside reaction. They react to bills, react to inflation, react to emergencies, react to fear, react to opportunities too late. But strategic people behave differently. They create structures before pressure arrives. They think years ahead while everyone else thinks only about next week. That alone separates builders from consumers. Look carefully at Joseph during the 7 years of abundance. Most people around him saw permission to spend. Joseph saw a temporary window requiring discipline. Look carefully at Solomon's kingdom. Most rulers accumulated treasure for status and military power. Solomon invested into trade routes, alliances, fleets, and infrastructure that continuously reproduced wealth. This is why their prosperity survived beyond emotion. Because emotion is unstable, systems are durable, and here's where the message becomes uncomfortable for modern culture. Most people want prosperity without responsibility. They want increase without structure. They want overflow without management. But biblical wealth never operated that way. In Scripture, increase usually followed stewardship. Responsibility came first. Multiplication came after. That pattern appears repeatedly. Joseph managed prison before he managed Egypt. David protected sheep before he ruled a kingdom. Solomon asked for wisdom before receiving wealth. The order matters, because wealth amplifies what already exists inside a person. If someone lacks discipline before money arrives, money usually magnifies chaos instead of freedom. That is why so many people earn more but still remain trapped financially. Their income changes, but their internal structure does not. Joseph and Solomon became powerful because they developed capacity before expansion arrived. Capacity to think clearly during uncertainty. Capacity to organize resources wisely. Capacity to delay gratification. Capacity to sustain vision longer than ordinary people. And this reveals the dangerous misunderstanding many people have about prosperity. Money itself is not the highest form of wealth. Wisdom is. Because money without wisdom eventually disappears. But wisdom can rebuild wealth even after total loss. The tragedy of modern society is not that people work hard. It is that most people work hard building systems they will never own. That is the hidden prison Solomon and Joseph escaped. Today, millions wake up exhausted, rush through traffic, sacrifice their health, postpone their families, and spend decades strengthening corporations, platforms, and institutions that can replace them within days. They call this security because the system trained them to fear uncertainty more than dependence. But dependence has a cost, and Solomon understood that cost long before the industrial world existed. A salary can sustain survival, but it rarely creates sovereignty. The moment income depends entirely on your continuous labor, your life becomes fragile. If your energy fails, income fails. If the company restructures, income disappears. If crisis strikes, fear enters immediately because nothing exists beyond the next paycheck. This is why biblical wealth always moved toward ownership, stewardship, and multiplication rather than permanent dependence on wages. Joseph did not save Egypt by becoming a harder worker. He saved Egypt by becoming an organizer of resources. Solomon did not become wealthy by increasing effort alone. He became wealthy by increasing leverage. That difference changes everything, because most people are taught to increase activity instead of increasing structure. Work more, hustle harder, stay busy, but activity without direction creates exhaustion, not freedom. Even Proverbs warns that labor without wisdom eventually collapses under its own weight. And this explains why so many people remain trapped financially despite earning more than previous generations. Consumption expands faster than discipline. Lifestyle expands faster than ownership. Debt expands faster than assets. People buy liabilities thinking they purchased success. They finance appearances while neglecting foundations. They consume abundance during good seasons, exactly like Egypt before Joseph intervened. Modern culture celebrates immediate gratification because impatient people are easier to control. A person addicted to constant consumption rarely builds long-term systems. They remain dependent on continuous income because their entire life is structured around maintenance rather than multiplication. But Solomon and Joseph thought differently. Every decision was connected to sustainability. Every resource had purpose. Every season required preparation. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: neither man allowed emotions to govern economic decisions. Fear did not control Joseph during famine preparation. Pride did not control Solomon during expansion. They operated through wisdom, structure, patience, and vision, while everyone around them reacted emotionally to temporary conditions. That is why their influence survived beyond individual moments. They were not merely accumulating wealth, they were constructing resilience. So, how do you actually apply this wisdom today without living in a palace, ruling a kingdom, or controlling trade routes across continents? You begin exactly where Joseph began. With stewardship over what already exists in your hands. Most people postpone transformation because they believe they need massive capital first. But Solomon and Joseph prove the opposite. Systems are usually born small. Discipline begins before visible abundance arrives. The first step is learning to separate income from assets. Income feeds the present. Assets protect the future. That distinction alone changes how you see money forever. A salary can help you survive, but assets eventually help you breathe. An asset is anything that continues producing value beyond the original effort invested into it. A business, a skill with scalable demand, investments, intellectual property, systems, infrastructure, distribution, knowledge that solves important problems. Joseph stored grain. Solomon built trade networks. Both understood delayed multiplication. And that is the second step modern people resist most: patience. Everything today pushes immediacy. Fast money, fast success, fast validation. But biblical wealth almost always grows through seasons. Planting first, waiting second, harvest later. That pattern appears everywhere in Scripture because it reflects reality itself. A farmer who digs up seeds every week to check growth destroys the harvest. Yet most people do this financially. They abandon strategies too early, panic during uncertainty, and constantly restart from zero. Solomon and Joseph remained committed long enough for systems to mature. The third step is learning administration. This is where many people fail. They ask God for increase while mismanaging what they already possess. But Scripture repeatedly connects multiplication with stewardship. Joseph organized resources carefully. Solomon diversified movement across multiple streams of commerce. Order created expansion. Chaos destroys it. And finally, there is a spiritual layer modern financial conversations almost completely ignore. Both men understood that wisdom itself was the true asset. Not money, not status, not appearance. Wisdom allowed them to adapt, rebuild, solve problems, and recognize opportunity inside uncertainty. That is why their influence survived conditions that would have destroyed ordinary people, because circumstances change constantly. But wisdom keeps producing value in every generation. At the end of everything, The greatest lesson from Solomon and Joseph is almost unsettling in its simplicity. Wealth was never their true obsession. Responsibility was. That is why prosperity followed them. Modern culture teaches people to chase money directly, but Scripture keeps pointing somewhere deeper. The men who changed nations were rarely the men most obsessed with gold. They were the men capable of carrying vision without collapsing under pressure. Joseph carried responsibility during famine. Solomon carried responsibility during expansion. Both understood that resources become dangerous in the hands of people without wisdom. And maybe that is the real reason so many people never sustain prosperity even when opportunities appear. They want increase without transformation. They want abundance while still thinking emotionally, spending impulsively, reacting constantly, and avoiding discipline. But biblical wealth never worked like that. God entrusted more to those who could manage more. That pattern has never changed, and this should completely transform the way you see prosperity from this moment forward. Money is not the goal. Money is the amplifier. It reveals structure or exposes chaos. It multiplies wisdom or magnifies foolishness. That is why Solomon asked for discernment before wealth ever arrived. And that is why Joseph developed management before authority was placed in his hands. Their riches were not accidents. They were consequences. Consequences of vision. Consequences of stewardship. Consequences of patience. Consequences of building systems stronger than temporary emotion. And perhaps this is the question that remains after everything you heard today. If greater resources suddenly entered your life tomorrow, would your current structure be strong enough to sustain them? Because the true source of wealth was never luck. It was wisdom, capable of multiplying what others wasted.